222 BC, the Salaja Pass. This is not the sound of a battle, it is the sound of a world ending. The air, thick with chalky dust and the metallic tang of blood, vibrates with an inhuman hum, the grinding rhythm of two great beasts locked in a death struggle. On one side, a forest of iron, the Macedonian sarissas of King Antigonus Doson, a 20-foot-long wall of spear points that rises and falls like the breathing of some colossal, scaled monster. On the other, a thinner, more desperate line of bronze and crimson, the last army of a reborn Sparta. For their king, Cleomenes III, watching from a ridge, every sound is a physical blow. The splintering crack of a shield is the sound of a law broken, a dream fractured. The high-pitched scream of a dying Spartiate is the sound of a hope expiring. He feels the oppressive July sun beating down on his helmet, the sweat stinging his eyes, but the heat is nothing compared to the icy dread coiling in his gut. He sees the flank of his army, commanded by his own brother Euclides, positioned precariously on the high ground, suddenly buckle and then disintegrate under a massive Illyrian charge. He sees the moment of betrayal, the defector Demodocus giving the false signal that springs the trap. The world narrows to a kaleidoscope of horror, crimson cloaks trampled into the pale earth, the disciplined roar of the Macedonian phalanx advancing, and the panicked, backward shuffle of his own men. This is the sensory assault of total failure, the smell of burning ideals and roasted flesh. This was the saga of the man who single-handedly resurrected the ghost of Sparta, who made the great powers of the Hellenistic world tremble, only to watch it all be devoured in a single afternoon. This is the narrative of him, the final king who believed in the ancient glory. And to understand how this visionary, this revolutionary, this would-be savior of Greece came to this desolate pass to witness the death of his creation, we must ask the central question. How does a man who seeks to resurrect a legend end up being consumed by it, losing not just to an army, but to the entire world? This is the narrative of him, Cleomenes III, the last echo of a thunderous war cry that had once terrified the world. But to comprehend the tragedy of the man, we must first return to the world that spawned him, a world where Sparta was no longer a name to be feared, but a relic to be pitied. This was the late 3rd century before the New Era, a geopolitical chessboard dominated by titans, the colossal successor kingdoms born from the shattered empire of Alexander the Great. In the north lay the kingdom of Macedon, ruled by the Antigonid dynasty, a military powerhouse, the forge of the phalanx, a predator state that viewed the fractured city-states of southern Greece as its natural sphere of influence, its backyard to be managed and controlled. To the south, across the wine-dark sea, sprawled the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, a behemoth of unimaginable wealth, its capital Alexandria, a global center of commerce and learning. The Ptolemies were the financiers of the age, their gold a weapon as potent as any spear, funding proxy wars and propping up client states across the Aegean to keep their Macedonian rivals perpetually off balance. Between these two giants, the old heartland of classical Greece was a chaotic tapestry of leagues, federations, and increasingly powerless city-states. The greatest of these new powers was the Achaean League, a federal union of cities across the Peloponnese, an ambitious and modern political experiment led by the cunning strategist Aratus of Sicyon. The League represented a new way forward, a path of cooperation and federalism, and it viewed Sparta not with awe, but with suspicion and contempt. And far to the west, a shadow was beginning to stretch across the Mediterranean, a new power speaking a different language, a republic of wolves named Rome, which was at that very moment locked in its own titanic struggles, but whose gaze would inevitably turn eastward. In this world of sprawling empires and new political unions, Cleomenes' Sparta was an anachronism, a living fossil. It was a state with a glorious past, but no present, a tourist destination for philosophers and travelers who came to gaze upon the strange, archaic customs of a people who had once been masters of Hellas. This was the brutal reality Cleomenes was born into, a world that had moved on, a world that had no place for a resurrected Sparta. His dream was therefore not merely a political ambition, it was a declaration of war against the very spirit of the age. To understand the fire that drove Cleomenes, we must descend into the cold, silent halls of 3rd century Sparta, a city haunted by the ghosts of its own greatness. He was born into the Agiad dynasty, one of the 2 royal houses of Sparta, but this was a kingship stripped of its ancient power, a hollow crown in a decaying state. He carried the blood of Heracles in his veins, or so the legends claimed, but the Sparta of his youth was a pale imitation of the disciplined, martial society described by Xenophon and idealized by Plato. The rigorous Lycurgan system, the bedrock of Spartan power, had crumbled from within. The agoge, the brutal state education that had forged peerless warriors, was a shadow of its former self. Most critically, the economic foundation of Sparta had been eroded. The laws of the mythical lawgiver Lycurgus had forbidden private wealth and concentrated all land in the hands of the state, distributed in equal plots, the kleroi, to its citizens. But over the centuries, through inheritance, debt, and greed, this land had become concentrated in the hands of a tiny, corrupt oligarchy. By the time Cleomenes was a boy, fewer than 700 men held the title of Spartiate, the full citizen warrior class that had once numbered in the thousands. The rest of the population consisted of disenfranchised poor, landless commoners, and a vast underclass of helots, the state-owned serfs who worked the land and lived in perpetual fear of the secret police, the Cryptaia. This was a state rotting from the head down, a pyramid balancing on its point. But the most formative ghost in Cleomenes' life was not a distant ancestor. It was the man who had married his future wife, the previous Agiad king, Agus IV. Agus had seen the rot and had attempted a revolution from the throne. He proposed the very reforms Cleomenes would later enact, the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. But Agus was an idealist, not a pragmatist. He was outmaneuvered by the wealthy oligarchs and their allies, the ephors, 5 annually elected magistrates who held the real power in Sparta. They had Agis arrested, subjected to a sham trial, and, in an act of unprecedented sacrilege, strangled in prison along with his mother and grandmother. Cleomenes, then just a boy, was forced to marry Agus's widow, the noble Agiatis. Through her, he inherited not a crown, but a martyr's cause. He grew up in a world where reform was synonymous with death, where the ruling class would rather strangle a king than surrender an ounce of their privilege. This was the poison that forged his character, a deep, abiding hatred for the oligarchy, a profound sense of historical mission inherited from his murdered predecessor, and the cold realization that to save Sparta, he could not be a gentle reformer like Agus. He had to be a surgeon, and the first cut had to be deep and ruthless. The first step into the great game for Cleomenes was not a battle or a decree. It was a meticulously planned act of state terror, a coup d'etat cloaked in the darkness of a Spartan night. He understood the lesson of Agus's failure perfectly. The ephors were the cancerous heart of the old, corrupt Sparta. They were the guardians of the status quo, the enforcers of oligarchic privilege, and as long as they held power, any attempt at reform was doomed to a prison cell and a hangman's noose. For years, he played the part of a conventional Spartan king, leading the army in minor border conflicts against the Achaean League, building his reputation as a competent military leader, and, crucially, earning the loyalty of the soldiers, most of whom were mercenaries and disenfranchised citizens who had everything to gain from a revolution. He waited for the perfect moment, the moment when his enemies were complacent and the political climate was ripe. In the year 227 BC, after a successful military campaign, he returned to Sparta not as a triumphant general, but as an executioner. He orchestrated his return to coincide with the evening meal of the ephors. As the 5 most powerful men in the state sat feasting, utterly oblivious to the doom descending upon them, Cleomenes struck. He dispatched his most loyal soldiers, men he had personally selected, to the dining hall. The scene, as described by the historian Plutarch, was one of shocking, brutal efficiency. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of intent. There was only the sudden crash of doors, the overturning of tables, and the glint of steel in the torchlight. The assassins fell upon the offers with ruthless speed. 4 of the 5 were cut down where they sat, their fine robes soaked in wine and blood. The 5th, Aegialeus, feigned death amidst the chaos and managed to crawl away into the darkness, the lone survivor of the purge. That same night, Cleomenes' men rounded up and executed the leading figures of the oligarchy, some 80 prominent citizens who had opposed Agus and stood in the way of change. By sunrise, the old Sparta was dead. Cleomenes addressed the remaining citizens in the assembly, his voice calm, his logic unassailable. He explained that he had not destroyed the law, but restored it. He had merely removed the cancers, the ephors, that had usurped the traditional power of the kings and brought Sparta to the brink of ruin. It was a masterful piece of political theater, presenting a bloody coup as a necessary purification. This was his first revelation to the world. Cleomenes wasn't another Agus. He was a man who understood that power did not come from ideals alone. It grew from the cold, hard ground of fear and the sharp edge of a sword. Behind the calculated ruthlessness and the sharp political mind lay the burning heart of a zealot, a man driven by an almost messianic conviction. To understand Cleomenes, we must understand that his revolution was not merely a power grab or a socio-economic program. In his own mind, it was a sacred crusade. This was his inner demon and his secret motivation, a profound and unshakable belief that he had been chosen by the gods, by the spirit of Lycurgus himself, to restore Sparta to its ancient, divinely ordained state of perfection. He was not just a king, he was an instrument of historical destiny. This belief was nurtured by the stories he heard from his wife Agiatis about her first husband, the martyred Agus, and it was amplified by the palpable decay he saw around him every day. He looked at the Sparta of his time and saw not a city, but a desecrated temple. He saw the handful of fabulously wealthy oligarchs, their lives a testament to greed and luxury, and saw them as blasphemers defiling a sacred tradition. He saw the disenfranchised poor, the thousands of landless men of Spartan blood, and saw them as a noble race brought low, their birthright stolen. He saw the vast population of helots and saw them not as human beings, but as a necessary foundation for the warrior state, a resource to be managed and controlled for the greater good of the master race. This worldview was fundamentally reactionary and deeply authoritarian. He wasn't trying to create a new future. He was trying to resurrect an idealized past, a semi-mythical Sparta of perfect equality, absolute discipline, and unquestioning obedience to the state. This inner fire explains the extremity of his actions. It allowed him to justify the murder of the ephors not as an assassination, but as a righteous cleansing. It allowed him to frame the confiscation of all private land and its redistribution not as a radical economic policy, but as a holy restoration of the Lycurgan order. This conviction gave him incredible strength and charisma. People followed him because he believed so absolutely in his own cause. He projected an aura of certainty in an age of confusion, offering the simple, powerful promise of a return to greatness. But this same inner fire was also his fatal flaw. It bred in him a dangerous inflexibility, an inability to compromise. He saw the world in stark, binary terms. Those who supported his vision were allies of virtue, and those who opposed it were enemies of Sparta, agents of corruption who needed to be crushed. This zealot's conviction would allow him to build a new Sparta from the ashes of the old, but it would also blind him to the complex political realities of the Hellenistic world, a world that could not be reshaped by sheer force of will alone. He believed he was restoring a divine order, but he was, in fact, building a house on the edge of a volcano. Every revolutionary needs a philosophy, an intellectual framework, to transform raw ambition into a righteous cause. For Cleomenes, this catalyst came in the form of a man named Spherus of Borysthenes. This fateful encounter between a king and a philosopher was the moment his revolution gained its soul, elevating a violent coup into a grand political and moral experiment. Spherus was a Stoic philosopher, a student of the famous Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. He was drawn to Sparta, as many intellectuals of the age were, by the legend of Lycurgus. He saw in the mythical Spartan constitution a real-world application of Stoic ideals. The emphasis on virtue, duty, indifference to wealth and pain, and the submission of the individual to the greater good of the whole. When Cleomenes seized power, Spherus saw not a tyrant, but a philosopher-king in the making, a man with the will and the power to turn Stoic theory into political reality. He became Cleomenes' chief advisor, his intellectual partner, and his most effective propagandist. It was Spherus who helped craft the ideological justification for the revolution. He provided Cleomenes with the language to frame his radical reforms, not as a departure from tradition, but as a pious return to it. The murder of the ephors became the removal of an unconstitutional tyranny. The redistribution of land became the restoration of the ancestral constitution. The creation of a new, larger citizen body became the revival of the true Spartan people. This alliance was mutually beneficial. For Cleomenes, Spherus provided the intellectual legitimacy he desperately needed. He was no longer just a ruthless warlord. He was the champion of a profound, philosophical ideal, a restorer of virtue in a corrupt age. This narrative was incredibly powerful, winning him allies not just in Sparta, but across Greece, where many were disgusted by the endless wars and gross inequality of the Hellenistic kingdoms. For Spherus, Cleomenes was the ultimate prize, a powerful ruler willing to implement his philosophical program on a grand scale. He became the architect of the new Spartan educational system, personally overseeing the revival of the agoge and the traditional Spartan discipline, ensuring that the next generation of Spartiates would be forged in the crucible of Stoic and Lycurgan principles. This partnership between the man of action and the man of ideas was the engine of the Cleomenian War. It transformed a local Spartan power struggle into a pan-Hellenic ideological conflict. The austere, revolutionary, Stoic-inspired vision of Cleomenes' Sparta versus the pragmatic, oligarchic, federalist model of the Achaean League. But it also contained a seed of destruction. By grounding his revolution in such a rigid and idealized philosophy, Cleomenes left no room for the messy realities of politics, for the compromises and concessions necessary for survival in a world governed not by philosophers, but by kings and generals. With the intellectual justification provided by Sparta and the old oligarchs dead or in exile, Cleomenes unleashed his revolution, shattering the foundations of Spartan society with a speed and thoroughness that left the Greek world breathless. This was the true price of power, a complete upending of the social and economic order. His first decree was the most radical of all, the cancellation of all outstanding debts. With a single proclamation, he wiped the slate clean, liberating the thousands of citizens who had been driven into penury and debt bondage by the wealthy elite. This was a direct assault on the principle of private property and contract, an act that immediately earned him the undying loyalty of the masses and the eternal hatred of the wealthy across all of Greece. His next step was even more audacious. He confiscated all the land in Laconia, the vast estates of the oligarchs, the small plots of the indebted farmers. Everything was seized by the state. He then divided this entire territory into 4,500 equal plots, the kleroi of ancient tradition. These were distributed to a newly created citizen body. He handpicked the best and most vigorous of the perioikoi, the free but non-citizen inhabitants of Lacedaemonian towns, and even some foreign mercenaries, granting them full Spartan citizenship and a plot of land. In a single stroke, he had solved Sparta's chronic manpower shortage, increasing the size of the citizen warrior class from a pathetic few hundred to a formidable body of nearly 5,000 men. This new army of citizens, their loyalty guaranteed by the gift of land and status, was then subjected to a revived and reinvigorated agage, the brutal traditional training regimen, personally supervised by Cleomenes and Sparta. They were also rearmed, not as traditional hoplites, but in the Macedonian fashion, with the deadly long pike, the sarissa. This was the genius of his reform. He used the revolutionary promise of socio-economic equality to create a powerful, modern army, funding a military renaissance with a social revolution. He was, in effect, the first state socialist in Western history, using the absolute power of the state to expropriate the rich and empower the poor for the explicit purpose of increasing its military might. This sent a shockwave across the Peloponnese. The rich in every city of the Achaean League looked at Cleomenes and saw a terrifying specter, a revolutionary who was not just an external enemy, but an internal threat, whose ideas could infect their own impoverished masses and bring their own comfortable world crashing down. He had not just rebuilt Sparta's army, he had turned Sparta into a revolutionary idea, an idea that was now on the march. The primary antagonist to Cleomenes' revolutionary Sparta was not a rival king or a foreign empire, at least not at first. It was something far more modern and complex, the Achaean League. This was not a clash of kings, but a clash of systems, a war between two opposing visions for the future of Greece. The Achaean League, under the leadership of the brilliant but cautious Aratus of Sicyon, represented a federalist ideal. It was a voluntary confederation of city-states in the northern and central Peloponnese that had banded together for mutual defense and governance. Each city retained control over its internal affairs, but they were united by a common assembly, a common army, and a rotating presidency, the strategos. The League was a remarkable political innovation, an attempt to overcome the chronic infighting and parochialism that had plagued Greek politics for centuries. It was governed by the propertied classes of its member cities, an oligarchy of the moderate and wealthy who valued stability and commerce above all else. To Aratus and the leaders of the League, Cleomenes was the embodiment of everything they feared. He represented a return to the old, dangerous model of single-city dominance, the very hegemonism that had led to the ruinous Peloponnesian War. More than that, he was a social revolutionary, a tyrannos who preached a gospel of debt cancellation and land redistribution. The wealthy oligarchs who ran the League knew that this Spartan disease could easily spread to their own cities, where the gap between rich and poor was just as vast. The conflict was therefore existential. For Cleomenes, the Achaean League was an obstacle to his dream of a Spartan-led Peloponnese, a weak and decadent collection of squabbling merchants who lacked the will to stand up to the true threat, the looming power of Macedon. He saw their federalism as a mask for weakness and their oligarchic rule as a source of corruption. He genuinely believed he was offering them liberation, a chance to join his crusade, to purify and strengthen Greece under Spartan leadership. The war that ensued, the Cleomenian War, was thus fought on two fronts. On the battlefield, it was a contest between Cleomenes' newly forged, highly motivated Spartan army and the League's larger but less cohesive federal forces, which often included mercenaries. But on the ideological front, it was a battle for the soul of Greece. Would the future lie with the revolutionary, authoritarian, collectivist model of Cleomenes' Sparta, or with the pragmatic, oligarchic, federalist model of the Achaean League? This fundamental opposition, this clash between the ghost of a military commune and the spirit of a commercial federation, was the central drama of the age, and its outcome would determine the fate of the Peloponnese. In the year 225 BC, at the height of his power, Cleomenes committed his first great and fatal mistake, an error born not of military miscalculation, but of psychological blindness. After a series of stunning victories, he had cornered the Achaean League. His greatest triumph came with the capture of Megalopolis, the great city, which had been founded by the Thebans specifically to be a bastion of anti-Spartan power in Arcadia. Its fall sent a shockwave of despair through the League. Cleomenes, however, showed a surprising degree of statesmanship. Instead of sacking the city, he occupied it and sent a remarkable offer to the Achaeans, who had fled to a nearby town. He proposed a grand alliance. He offered to return their city to them, unharmed, on one condition: that the Achaean League abandon its alliance with Macedon and instead accept him, the king of Sparta, as its hegemon, its leader. It was a brilliant strategic move. It offered the Achaeans peace with honor, preserved their league, and would have created a unified Peloponnesian superpower under his command, strong enough to resist any external threat. For a moment, the future of Greece hung in the balance, but Cleomenes had fatally underestimated the character of his chief adversary, Aratus of Sicyon. Aratus, hearing the proposal, was plunged into a personal hell. He saw the strategic genius of the offer, but he was blinded by his personal hatred and ideological fear of Cleomenes. To Aratus, Cleomenes was a tyrant, a butcher of oligarchs, a dangerous radical whose very existence threatened the social order he had spent his life building. The thought of accepting this revolutionary king as his leader was anathema. As Plutarch recounts, when the Achaean assembly seemed inclined to accept the generous terms, Aratus stood before them, weeping, and delivered a speech filled with venom and fear, reminding them of the crimes of the Spartan king. He convinced them to reject the offer. The message sent back to Cleomenes was one of defiant refusal. It was at this moment that Cleomenes' character underwent a fatal shift. The statesman vanished, replaced by the enraged zealot. Feeling his generosity had been spurned, his grand vision for Greece rejected by petty, fearful men, he unleashed his fury. He ordered the complete and systematic destruction of Megalopolis. The city was looted, its buildings torn down, its population scattered. He did not just defeat the city, he erased it. This act of calculated terror was his breaking point. He had hoped to be a leader, but now he had become a destroyer. The act galvanized his enemies, transforming a political dispute into a war of annihilation. It gave Aratus the moral justification he needed for the ultimate betrayal, inviting the king of Macedon to bring his army south and crush the Spartan resurgence. The smoke rising from the ruins of Megalopolis was the funeral pyre of Cleomenes' dream of a united Peloponnese. The rejection of his peace offer and the destruction of Megalopolis marked a turning point, plunging the conflict into a new and more brutal phase. Yet it was in this moment of escalating chaos that Cleomenes demonstrated his true military genius. While Aratus was negotiating the final details of his treacherous pact with Macedon, Cleomenes seized the opportunity created by his enemy's hesitation and launched a brilliant lightning campaign across the Peloponnese. He understood that his window of opportunity was closing. Soon, the full might of the Macedonian kingdom would descend upon him. His only hope was to shatter the Achaean League completely before the northern reinforcements could arrive. His campaign was a masterpiece of speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. He did not move like a traditional hoplite army, lumbering from one siege to another. He moved like a thunderbolt. He started by marching on Argos, one of the most ancient and prestigious cities in the Peloponnese, and a cornerstone of the Achaean League. He timed his arrival to coincide with the Nemean Games, knowing the city would be distracted and its defenses lax. He took Argos without a fight. The populace, many of whom were poor and sympathetic to his revolutionary message, simply opened the gates to him. The fall of Argos triggered a domino effect. City after city, disillusioned with Aratus's leadership and terrified of Cleomenes' army, defected from the Achaean League and declared for Sparta. Phlius, Cleonae, Hermione, Trozen, the league seemed to be disintegrating before Aratus's eyes. The climax of this stunning campaign came with the capture of Corinth, the strategic linchpin of Greece, a wealthy fortress city that controlled the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the north. Again, the city fell with barely a fight. Cleomenes had achieved what no Spartan king had done since the days of Agesilaus. He had made himself the undisputed master of the Peloponnese. This was his opportunity from chaos. He had exploited the Achaean League's internal divisions, the unpopularity of Aratus's pro-Macedonian policy, and the widespread appeal of his own social program among the poor. He now stood at the head of a new Peloponnesian alliance, his army swollen with new recruits. He was no longer just the king of Sparta. He was the most powerful man in Greece. It was a moment of supreme, intoxicating triumph, the culmination of years of planning and ruthless action. The world he had envisioned was now within his grasp. The spring of 224 BC marks the absolute zenith of Cleomenes' power and the greatest triumph of his career. He stands on the Acrocorinth, the towering citadel that dominates the Isthmus of Corinth, the gateway to the Peloponnese. From this vantage point, the whole of his achievement is laid out before him. Below him lies the wealthy city of Corinth, now his garrison. To the south, the entire Peloponnese, Argos, Arcadia, and his own reborn Laconia, is under his control. The Achaean League, his sworn enemy, is reduced to a rump state, its leader Aratus, a virtual prisoner in his hometown of Sicyon. To the north, across the narrow strip of land, lies the rest of Greece, a land filled with cities that look to him with a mixture of fear and hope. This is a scene of immense sensory power. Imagine the crisp spring air, the scent of the sea from the two gulfs on either side, the glint of the sun on the armor of his Spartan garrison. Imagine the sounds, the distant clamor of the port city, the confident shouts of his soldiers, and the profound, satisfying silence of a conquered continent at his feet. This was more than a military victory. It was an ideological one. He had proven that his revolutionary Sparta was not a fluke, not a doomed experiment, but a viable and powerful new force in Hellenic politics. He had shattered the Achaean League, exposed its weaknesses, and now held its fate in his hands. Envoys came to him from across the Greek world. He received the prestigious title of hegemon, leader of the new alliance. For a brief, shining moment, the dream seemed not just possible, but inevitable. A purified, strengthened Greece, united under the leadership of a revived, virtuous Sparta, capable of standing against any foreign power, be it Macedon in the north or the growing shadow of Rome in the west. This was the moment his martyred predecessor, Agus, could only have dreamed of. He had avenged his death, vindicated his ideals, and achieved a level of success that must have felt like divine affirmation. Standing there on the isthmus, Cleomenes was not just a king. He was the master of Hellas, the arbiter of its destiny. The revolution had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. In this moment of supreme triumph, standing on the pinnacle of his power at the Isthmus of Corinth, we must attempt to enter the mind of Cleomenes and understand the psychology of his victory. This was his moment of profound, dangerous hubris. He no longer saw himself as a mere king of Sparta, but as a figure of historical, almost mythical significance. He was the new Lycurgus. The mythical lawgiver had founded the Spartan system. He, Cleomenes, had resurrected it from the grave. This was not just a political achievement. It was a miracle, a testament to his own unique genius and the manifest favor of the gods. This belief, nurtured by the Stoic philosophy of Sphaerus and confirmed by an unbroken string of victories, now hardened into an unshakable conviction. He saw his success not as the result of favorable circumstances, tactical brilliance, and his enemy's mistakes, but as the unfolding of a preordained destiny. He was the savior of Hellas, and his will was the will of history itself. This psychological state had profound consequences. It made him utterly confident in his own judgment and increasingly contemptuous of his opponents. He saw Aratus not as a clever political rival, but as a corrupt, pathetic traitor to the Hellenic cause. He saw the Achaeans not as a people with a different political vision, but as decadent cowards who needed his firm hand to guide them. This sense of moral and intellectual superiority blinded him to the storm he had unleashed. He failed to grasp the depth of the fear he inspired in the propertied classes throughout Greece. He failed to understand that Aratus's decision to call in the Macedonians was not an act of simple cowardice, but a calculated choice born of an existential terror of social revolution. He believed he could create a new order through sheer force of will, that the righteousness of his cause would inevitably triumph. This hubris led him to a critical underestimation of his true enemy, not Aratus, but King Antigonus Doson of Macedon. He saw Antigonus as just another Hellenistic monarch, a foreign king who had no real business in the Peloponnese. He did not yet understand that Antigonus was a shrewd and capable ruler who saw in Aratus's plea not a simple request for aid, but a golden opportunity to reassert Macedonian hegemony over all of Greece, a prize for which he would mobilize the entire resources of his kingdom. As Cleomenes stood basking in the glory of his triumph, he was a man intoxicated by his own legend, deaf to the approaching footsteps of a far greater power, a power he had, through his own success, inadvertently summoned against himself. To truly understand the fall of Cleomenes, we must understand the man who engineered it. His sworn enemy was not a rival warrior king, but a man of a completely different breed. Aratus of Sicyon. This was the fox to Cleomenes' lion, a man whose primary weapons were patience, intrigue, and a deep understanding of political psychology. Aratus's life was a drama in itself. As a child, his father, the ruler of Sicyon, had been murdered, and he had escaped death by a hair's breadth, growing up in exile in Argos. This experience forged in him a lifelong, pathological hatred of tyrants and a deep-seated belief in collective governance by the better sort of people, the wealthy and educated. He was a liberator in his own right, having personally freed his home city of Sicyon from its dictator, an act of legendary daring. He was the principal architect of the Achaean League's expansion, transforming it from a minor regional alliance into the dominant power in the Peloponnese. He was not a great general. In fact, he was often criticized for his lack of military prowess. But he was a master diplomat, a superb administrator, and a political strategist of the first rank. The chemistry between Aratus and Cleomenes was one of pure ideological opposition. Aratus saw in Cleomenes the terrifying ghost of tyranny reborn, a charismatic demagogue using the language of social justice to mask a lust for absolute power. He saw Cleomenes' reforms not as a noble restoration, but as a chaotic and dangerous upheaval that threatened to plunge all of Greece into civil war. Their personal drama was the heart of the Cleomenian War. While Cleomenes was winning battles, Aratus was working in the shadows, using diplomacy to isolate him, spreading propaganda that painted him as a bloodthirsty radical, and holding the fragile Achaean League together through the sheer force of his personality. His ultimate decision to invite Antigonus and the Macedonians into the Peloponnese must be understood in this context. To modern observers, and even to many of his contemporaries like Plutarch, it was an act of profound betrayal, a surrender of Greek freedom to a foreign king simply to defeat a domestic rival. But in Aratus's mind, it was a terrible but necessary choice. He was choosing the lesser of two evils. He believed that Macedonian hegemony, which could be managed and negotiated with, was preferable to the existential threat of a pan-Peloponnesian social revolution led by a Spartan tyrant. He was a man who feared chaos more than he feared foreign domination. This cold, pragmatic, and ultimately tragic calculation was the weapon that would ultimately bring Cleomenes' soaring ambition crashing down to earth. While the world focused on his wars and revolutionary decrees, a crucial part of Cleomenes' project was the systematic and detailed reconstruction of the Spartan military. This was not simply a matter of recruiting more soldiers. It was a fundamental reform of how Sparta waged war, a conscious decision to blend ancient ideology with modern military science. Forging this new phalanx was the practical bedrock of his entire Renaissance. He recognized that the traditional Spartan way of war, based on the small, elite force of hoplites with their large shields and short swords, was obsolete. It had been proven ineffective against the new combined arms tactics and, most importantly, the pike phalanx developed by Philip II and Alexander the Great. The first step was his social revolution. By creating 4,500 new citizens and giving them land, he created a large, motivated recruitment pool, solving the manpower crisis that had crippled Sparta for over a century. The next step was training. Under his and Spherus' direct supervision, these new citizens were put through a revived and unforgiving agog. This was not just physical conditioning. It was psychological indoctrination, designed to strip away individuality and forge a collective identity based on discipline, obedience, and fanatical loyalty to the state and its king. The final and most critical step was rearmament. Cleomenes completely abandoned the traditional hoplite panoply. He re-equipped his new army in the Macedonian style. The iconic large round aspis was replaced by a smaller shield worn on the forearm, freeing up both hands to wield the weapon that had conquered the known world. The sarissa, a fearsome pike that could be up to 18 feet long. This transformed the Spartan army. It was now capable of meeting a Macedonian phalanx on its own terms, presenting an unstoppable wall of spear points. He also understood the importance of combined arms. He supplemented his phalanx with light infantry units, the perioikoi, and mercenary cavalry. The result was a formidable, modern, and highly motivated fighting machine, arguably the best army in Greece at the time. This reformed army was the tool that allowed him to overrun the Peloponnese and challenge the great powers. But it also embodied the central contradiction of his reign. It was a modern, Hellenistic-style army built upon the foundation of a resurrected, archaic, and deeply ideological social system. He was using the military tools of the New World to fight for the ideals of an old one. This powerful but inherently unstable fusion would prove devastatingly effective in the short term. But its ultimate test would come when it faced the full, professional might of the kingdom that had invented the very system he was now copying. Behind the grand sweep of geopolitics and military campaigns, the personal life of Cleomenes was deeply intertwined with his political destiny, marked by love, sacrifice, and ultimately, tragedy. These were the onions and vegetables that gave flavor and poignancy to his epic saga. The central figure in his personal life was his wife, Agiatis. She was the widow of the murdered king Agis IV, and Cleomenes had been forced to marry her as a young man by his father. What began as a political union blossomed into a deep and genuine love. Agiatis was more than just a wife. She was the living link to the martyred cause of reform. She shared with him the stories of Agus's noble ideals and his tragic betrayal, fueling the fire of vengeance and justice that already burned within him. Her love and unwavering support provided him with an emotional anchor in the turbulent sea of his ambitions. Her death, sometime before the Macedonian invasion, was a devastating personal blow, removing a key source of counsel and comfort at the most critical juncture of his reign. But the most wrenching personal sacrifice Cleomenes had to make involved the two people he was sworn to protect: his mother, Cratysicleia, and his young children. As the threat from Macedon grew, Cleomenes desperately needed an alliance with Ptolemy III of Egypt, the only power rich enough to fund his war effort and potentially create a second front against Antigonus. Ptolemy agreed to provide subsidies, but he demanded a steep price: hostages to ensure Cleomenes' loyalty. He specifically demanded the king's own mother and children. Plutarch gives a moving account of the scene. Cleomenes, the ruthless revolutionary and hardened warrior, hesitated to tell his mother what was required of her. Cratysicleia, however, displaying the legendary fortitude of a Spartan woman, did not flinch. She reprimanded her son for his hesitation, declaring she was willing and eager to go, to do whatever was necessary for the good of Sparta. She embarked on the ship to Alexandria with her grandchildren, walking to her gilded captivity with her head held high. This act reveals the immense personal cost of Cleomenes' ambition. He was forced to subordinate the most fundamental human bonds, the love for his mother, the protection of his children, to the demands of the state and his historical mission. He was living the very ideal he preached, the total submission of the individual to the collective. But it left him increasingly isolated, a man who had sacrificed his personal happiness on the altar of his grand and increasingly perilous political dream. The triumphant celebrations on the Isthmus of Corinth had barely ended when the first cracks began to appear in Cleomenes' grand edifice. The harbingers of the storm were gathering in the north, and their shadow was beginning to stretch across the Peloponnese. The source of this impending doom was the very man Cleomenes had so thoroughly humiliated: Aratus of Sicyon. From his refuge in Sicyon, Aratus made the final, fateful move he had been planning for months. He completed his negotiations with King Antigonus Doson of Macedon, formally inviting him to intervene in the affairs of southern Greece. This was a moment of profound historical significance, a betrayal of the principle of Greek autonomy that had been a cornerstone of Aratus' own career. To secure Macedonian aid, Aratus had to promise Antigonus the one thing he craved. The Acra Corinth, the citadel of Corinth, the very symbol of Cleomenes' triumph. Antigonus, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, seized the opportunity with both hands. This was the justification he needed to march south, not as a conqueror, but as the invited liberator of the Achaeans and the protector of the Greek leagues against the tyranny of Sparta. He began to mobilize the full resources of the Macedonian kingdom, its professional army, its siege train, and its vast treasury. The news of this alliance sent a tremor of fear through Cleomenes' coalition. Many of the cities that had eagerly joined him, like Argos, had done so out of opposition to the Achaean League, not out of a desire for a full-scale war with the mighty kingdom of Macedon. Loyalty began to waver. The first major blow came when a faction in Argos, encouraged by Aratus' agents, rose in rebellion against Cleomenes' garrison. Cleomenes was forced to abandon his strategic position on the isthmus and rush south to put down the revolt. The moment he left, Antigonus and his massive army crossed the border and descended into the Peloponnese. The strategic situation had been completely reversed. Cleomenes was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. He was now caught in a trap, with the Macedonian army to his north and increasingly rebellious cities to his south. The war had transformed from a regional Peloponnesian conflict into a full-scale confrontation with a first-rate Hellenistic power. The odds had shifted dramatically against him. The storm had broken, and Cleomenes now had to face the consequences of a world that he had, through his own ambition, united against him. Faced with the combined power of the Macedonian kingdom and the reconstituted Achaean League, Cleomenes was forced back, step by step, into his home territory of Laconia. The grand Peloponnesian alliance he had built collapsed as quickly as it had formed. He was now cornered, his resources dwindling, his Egyptian subsidies proving insufficient to counter the vast wealth of Macedon. It was in this desperate situation that he made the fateful act, the single strategic decision that would trigger the final, catastrophic finale. The choice to stake everything on a single, decisive battle at the Salasia Pass. From a purely military perspective, the decision was defensible, even logical. He could not win a long war of attrition. Antigonus had more men, more money, and could afford to wait him out. A protracted war would see his army slowly wither away while his enemy grew stronger. His only hope lay in a decisive victory, a battle so crushing that it would shatter the morale of the invading army and force Antigonus to retreat. He chose his ground carefully. The Salasia Pass was the northern gateway to the Spartan heartland, a narrow valley flanked by two hills, Olympus and Euus. It was a superb defensive position, allowing his smaller army to neutralize the enemy's numerical superiority. He fortified the hills with trenches and palisades and deployed his forces brilliantly, with his brother Euclides commanding the left wing on Euus and he himself commanding the elite Spartan phalanx on Olympus. But the decision was not purely military, it was also psychological. It was a choice born of the very character that had brought him so far. Cleomenes was a gambler, an innovator, a man who believed in bold, decisive strokes. He had seized his throne with a sudden coup, launched his revolution with radical decrees, and conquered the Peloponnese with a lightning campaign. He believed in his army, which he had personally forged and trained. He believed in his own destiny as the savior of Sparta. This unwavering self-belief, once his greatest strength, now became his greatest vulnerability. He chose to fight at Salasia because his entire worldview, his very identity as the new Lycurgus, demanded a heroic, winner-take-all confrontation. A slow, grinding guerrilla war, a retreat into the mountains of Taygetus, might have been a more prudent strategy, but it was not his way. It was the way of a fox like Aratus, not a lion like Cleomenes. He chose to meet the Macedonian juggernaut head-on, staking his revolution, his kingdom, and his life on one single, glorious throw of the dice. It was a magnificent, heroic, and ultimately suicidal gamble. The Battle of Silesia was not merely a defeat, it was an annihilation, the hellish forge in which Cleomenes' entire revolutionary project was melted down and destroyed. For hours the battle raged, a brutal and evenly matched contest. On the right flank, Cleomenes and his Spartan phalanx held their ground against the main body of the Macedonian infantry, the famous bronze shields. The newly forged Spartan pikes, wielded by men fighting for their homes and their ideals, proved a match for the seasoned professionals of Antigonus's army. The sensory reality of this struggle would have been overwhelming. The constant, rhythmic crash of pike shafts and shields, the roar of thousands of men straining in the summer heat, the screams of the wounded trampled underfoot in the tight confines of the phalanx. The air would have been a choking mixture of dust, sweat, and the coppery smell of blood. The turning point came not in the main clash of pikes, but on the flanks. On the hill of Euos, Cleomenes' brother Euclides made a fatal tactical error. He held the high ground, but failed to use it to his advantage, allowing the Macedonian forces, including elite Illyrian troops, to charge uphill and engage him at close quarters. The fighting was savage, but the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. It was at this critical moment that the betrayal occurred. According to the historian Philarchus, a Spartan officer named Damoteles, secretly in the pay of the enemy, gave Cleomenes a false report, assuring him that all was well on the other flank. At the same time, Antigonus unleashed his final reserve, a flanking maneuver that caught Euclides' beleaguered troops from behind. The Spartan left wing shattered. Euclides himself was killed, fighting to the last. The sight of this collapse sent a wave of panic through the rest of the army. Cleomenes, seeing his brother's forces being cut to pieces and his entire position unraveling, knew that the battle was lost. He fought a desperate rearguard action, trying to extricate what was left of his elite Spartan phalanx. But it was too late. The retreat turned into a rout. The Macedonian and Achaean cavalry, held in reserve for this very moment, descended upon the fleeing Spartans, cutting them down without mercy. Of the 6,000 men in Cleomenes' army, it is said that only 200 escaped the slaughter. The revolutionary army, the product of years of reform and training, had ceased to exist. In a single afternoon, the military power of Sparta had been utterly broken. The dream had died in the dust and blood of the Silesia Pass. The aftermath of Silesia was a blur of despair and collapse. For Cleomenes, the psychological shock must have been absolute. He had gambled everything and lost everything. The king, who had never known defeat, had just presided over the greatest catastrophe in Spartan history since Leuctra. His flight from the battlefield was not merely a retreat, it was the flight of a broken man. He raced back to Sparta, outstripping the news of his own defeat, a king returning to his capital as a fugitive. He arrived in the city he had remade, the city for which he had sacrificed everything, and his message to the waiting citizens was one of utter finality. He told them not to resist, not to die in a pointless last stand. He urged them to surrender to Antigonus, whom he acknowledged as a merciful victor. His revolutionary project was over, and his only remaining duty was to save the lives of his people. With that, he made the most agonizing decision of his life, to abandon his city, his throne, and his homeland. His destination was the sea, the port of Gythium, from where he hoped to sail to Egypt. He was going to seek refuge at the court of his ally, Ptolemy, the king who held his mother and children as hostages. It was his last, desperate hope. Perhaps with Egyptian gold, he could raise a new mercenary army and one day return. This final scene in Sparta is one of profound pathos. The revolutionary lawgiver, the conqueror of the Peloponnese, was now a king without a kingdom, his only thought to escape the approaching enemy. As Antigonus marched into Sparta unopposed, becoming the first foreign conqueror to ever enter the city, he behaved with magnanimity. He did not sack the city or harm its people. He simply abolished Cleomenes' reforms, restored the power of the ephors and the old oligarchy, and effectively turned Sparta into a client state of Macedon. The Cleomenian Revolution was officially dead. The old, corrupt order that Cleomenes had so violently overthrown was put back in place. For the disenfranchised poor who had briefly tasted freedom and dignity, the collapse was total. Their lands were taken away, their debts reinstated. The ghost of Lycurgus had been exorcised. As Cleomenes sailed away from the shores of Laconia, watching his homeland recede into the distance, he was not just a king in exile. He was the living embodiment of a failed idea, a man adrift on a sea of loss. The final act of Cleomenes' tragedy played out not on a battlefield in Greece, but in the gilded cage of Alexandria, the sprawling, multicultural metropolis of Ptolemaic Egypt. His arrival at the court of Ptolemy III, resurrect, was not the welcome of an honored ally, but the reception of a useful pawn. This was the hero's finale, a caged lion, stripped of his power, but not his pride, forced to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue. Ptolemy treated him with respect, giving him a generous allowance and promising to help him regain his throne. But these were empty promises. The wily Egyptian king saw Cleomenes not as a fellow monarch to be restored, but as a valuable chess piece to be used against his rival, Antigonus of Macedon. As long as Cleomenes was alive in Alexandria, he was a perpetual threat that Ptolemy could hold over Antigonus's head, a potential source of instability in Greece that could be unleashed at any moment. Cleomenes, the man of action, was forced to endure a life of frustrating idleness. He watched from afar as Antigonus died and was succeeded by a young Philip V, seeing opportunity after opportunity to return to Greece slip by while his Egyptian host delayed and dissembled. The situation grew worse when Ptolemy III died and was succeeded by his debauched and paranoid son, Ptolemy IV Philopator. The new king and his corrupt minister, Sosibius, feared Cleomenes. They saw his fierce pride, his military reputation, and the loyalty of his small band of Spartan exiles, not as an asset, but as a threat to their own unstable regime. They effectively placed him under house arrest, his gilded cage now a true prison. In the year 219 BC, after 2 years of this suffocating captivity, Cleomenes' spirit could take no more. He chose to die a Spartan's death. With his 13 remaining loyal followers, he broke out of his confinement and made a desperate, hopeless appeal to the people of Alexandria to rise up against their corrupt ruler. But the cosmopolitan, apathetic crowds of the city merely stared at this strange, wild-eyed Greek king as if he were a performer in a play. No one joined him. Realizing the cause was lost, Cleomenes and his followers did not wait to be captured. They retreated to a quiet side street, and there, in a final act of defiance, they took their own lives. Cleomenes was the last to die, ensuring all his comrades were gone before falling on his own sword. It was an end of astonishing, tragic irony. The king who had fought to restore the most fiercely independent state in history died as a political prisoner, trying to incite a revolt among a foreign people who neither knew nor cared for his cause. The legacy of Cleomenes III is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a testament to the profound ambiguity of his life and actions. For centuries after his death, his story was told and retold, with each historian and each generation casting him in a different light. This is the ultimate conflict. Was he a savior or a tyrant? A heroic visionary or a ruthless demagogue? The answer depends entirely on the lens through which one views him. To his supporters, both in his own time and later, he was a tragic hero, the last true Hellene. They saw him as a patriot who fought to restore the ancestral virtues of Sparta and to liberate Greece from the corrupting influence of both Macedonian gold and Achaean mediocrity. The historian Philarchus, whose work was a key source for Plutarch, clearly saw him in this light, portraying him as a noble, if flawed, idealist. In this interpretation, his radical reforms were not acts of tyranny, but necessary, painful surgery to save a dying patient. The murder of the ephors was the justifiable removal of traitors. The redistribution of land was an act of supreme justice. His war against the Achaeans was a crusade to unite Greece against the coming storm from the north. His ultimate failure was not a result of his own flaws, but a tragedy brought about by the cowardice and betrayal of lesser men like Aratus, who chose foreign servitude over Greek liberty. On the other hand, to his enemies, and to many historians like Polybius, who wrote from the perspective of the Achaean League, Cleomenes was a classic tyrant in the mold of the worst despots of Greek history. They saw a man driven by insatiable personal ambition, who cloaked his lust for power in the noble language of reform. In this view, his revolution was nothing more than a violent power grab. He used the legitimate grievances of the poor as a tool, inciting class warfare to make himself the absolute master of the state. His destruction of Megalopolis was proof of his inherent cruelty, and his war against the League was an act of naked aggression aimed at destroying a successful federalist experiment and imposing Spartan hegemony. His talk of restoring the laws of Lycurgus was merely clever propaganda to justify the creation of a military dictatorship. This fundamental debate continues to this day. Was he a proto-socialist reformer fighting for the disenfranchised, or an authoritarian nationalist using revolutionary rhetoric to build a war machine? The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the complex, gray area between these two extremes. He was perhaps both, a sincere idealist who was also ruthlessly ambitious, a genuine reformer who was not afraid to use the methods of a tyrant. We return, finally, to the core question, the central dramatic paradox of his life. How did a man who came so close to resurrecting an ancient glory end up crushed by the entire world? The final answer is that Cleomenes was a man fighting a war not just against armies, but against time itself. He failed because he was a ghost from another age, attempting to impose the ideals of a small, archaic, isolationist city-state onto a vast, interconnected, and irrevocably changed Hellenistic world. His project was doomed from the start by this fundamental contradiction. The Sparta of Lycurgus, which he so deeply venerated, was a product of a unique and long-vanished historical moment. It was a military commune designed to dominate a small region, the Peloponnese, in an era of small-scale hoplite warfare. The world of the 3rd century BC was a world of empires. Power was no longer measured by the discipline of a few thousand citizen soldiers, but by the size of a kingdom's treasury, its ability to hire tens of thousands of mercenaries, its command of siege technology, and its sophisticated diplomatic reach. Cleomenes' reforms, while brilliant, could never overcome this disparity in scale. He could create a superb army of 5,000 men, but Antigonus of Macedon could field an army of nearly 30,000, funded by the mines and taxes of a vast kingdom. He could win the loyalty of the poor in the Peloponnese, but he could not counter the deep-seated fear he inspired in the wealthy and powerful oligarchs who controlled the levers of power in every Greek city. This fear is what ultimately destroyed him. Aratus's decision to call in the Macedonians was not merely a personal betrayal, it was a class-based response to a perceived revolutionary threat. The propertied classes of Greece chose a foreign king over a domestic revolutionary. Furthermore, Cleomenes' own ideology was a trap. His belief in Spartan exceptionalism and his role as a new Lycurgus made him incapable of the very thing that might have saved him: compromise. His vision was totalizing. A city was either with him or against him. The Achaean League had to submit to his leadership, not partner with him. This inflexibility, born of his zealous conviction, ensured that he would face a united coalition of all the forces he had threatened: the federalism of the Achaeans, the monarchism of Macedon, and the oligarchies of every city in Greece. He was broken, in the end, not by a single enemy, but by the combined weight of the New World Order. He was a brilliant, heroic, and tragic anachronism. The universal lesson of Cleomenes' life is a profound and timeless tragedy: the tragedy of the last believer. His story is a powerful cautionary tale about the danger of falling in love with a beautiful, heroic past. It explores the fate of the idealist who believes so fervently in a noble, bygone idea that he fails to recognize that the world which created that idea has vanished forever. Cleomenes looked at Sparta and saw the legend of Thermopylae. The world around him saw a failed state and a museum piece. He believed he could revive the spirit of Lycurgus through sheer force of will, but he could not revive the geopolitical conditions that had made the Lycurgan system viable. He was trying to transplant an ancient exotic plant into a soil that could no longer sustain it. His life is a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of historical change. History is a river that flows in only one direction, and even the strongest and most charismatic leader cannot force it to flow backward. Those who try are often celebrated for their heroism and vision, but they are almost always crushed by the current. He represents the eternal struggle between heritage and progress, between the pull of a glorious past and the inexorable push of a complex future. His failure demonstrates that political and social systems are not abstract ideals that can be implemented at will. They are organic outgrowths of specific material and historical conditions. You cannot have a Spartan state without the isolation, the helot system, and the specific balance of power of the early archaic period. To attempt to do so in the age of Hellenistic empires was like trying to fight a tank with a sword, no matter how beautifully crafted or skillfully wielded that sword might be. The verdict of history on Cleomenes is that he was a man of immense courage, vision, and ability, a leader who possessed many of the qualities of greatness. But he yoked all of these remarkable gifts to an impossible cause. He was the last man who truly believed in Sparta, and his tragedy is that he was born into a world that had already moved on, a world that could admire his beautiful, ghostly vision, but would ultimately have to destroy it. The final frame of this epic saga is not the heroic king on the battlefield, nor the triumphant reformer in his city. It is a small, gruesome scene on a back street in Alexandria, a world away from the sun-drenched hills of Laconia. The body of Cleomenes lies on the dusty ground, his crimson cloak, the last vestige of his Spartan identity, stained dark with his own blood. His few loyal companions lie dead around him. The city hums on, indifferent. Merchants haggle in the nearby market, scholars debate in the great library, and the corrupt King Ptolemy drinks wine in his palace. The death of the last Spartan king causes barely a ripple in the life of the great metropolis. This is the enduring image, the ultimate isolation of the idealist, the silence that greets the fall of a man who lived his life at a fever pitch. His body would later be flayed and crucified by the vengeful Ptolemy, a final, grotesque humiliation. But that crucified body, hanging against the Egyptian sky, becomes a powerful and haunting metaphor. It is the image of a dead idea, a failed revolution, publicly displayed as a warning to all others who might dare to dream of turning back the clock. The blood on the Alexandrian street is the final, bitter price of a magnificent obsession. It is the residue of a ghost story, the saga of a man who tried to grab a fistful of smoke, who wrestled with the spirit of his ancestors and lost. The shadow of this last Spartan lion would linger for a time, a memory of what might have been, but the world would continue its inexorable march forward, leaving his tragic, heroic, and impossible dream to be buried by the sands of time.